Hello again everybody, and welcome to video number 31 of my Linux Commands for Beginners series. And in this video I'm going to go over standard input, standard output, standard error, as well as how to redirect output. Now I know that's a lot of content for one video, but each of these concepts are directly related to each other, so please bear with me. Now standard input, output, and error can be difficult to understand for a beginner, so I'm going to break them down and define them as simply as I possibly can. Now this is probably a confusing concept only because when you look up information on Google about standard input, output, and error, a lot of the articles I've seen are just huge. There's just paragraphs upon paragraphs of information. It's just information overload, and I honestly think that's the only reason why it can be confusing. When you break it down to the basics, it's actually pretty easy to understand. So what is standard input, output, and error? Well, basically, standard output is anything that you execute on the terminal where the results are printed right to the terminal. Now, for example, if I do ls/home/my username, and you see a list of files here, this is standard output. Basically, it's basically sending the contents of this folder to standard output, which is displayed on the screen. That's really all standard output is. It's just anything that's displayed on your screen. It would be the same thing if you had a text file and you executed cat text file, or whatever the name of the text file is. It would display the contents of that text file to standard output. So that is basically all standard output is. Standard error is anything that's output to the terminal that is an error message or considered an error. Now, an easy way to generate standard error, at least the easiest way I know of, is doing ls on /root. /root is the home directory of the root user account. A normal user does not have permission to see anything in this folder. So if I press enter, I get permission denied. This is an error. So essentially it is standard error. So when you execute ls/root, you're not going to get standard output because there is no standard output. You don't have permission to get the standard output. It's only a standard error, which is just telling you you can't view the contents of that folder. So there is standard error. Now, standard input, I'm just going to tell you what that is. I'm not actually going to go over that in this video because standard input, the only thing I could think of that would make that useful is bash scripting, and we're not going over bash scripting, but standard input is basically, as you might guess, taking input from the user. And oftentimes you're taking input from the user and you're storing that into a variable when you're programming or something. That's what standard input is. So I'm not going to go over that again. I just wanted to let you know what it is. We're just going to go over standard output and standard error very briefly. So I just showed you what standard output was, and that's just showing you anything that prints to the screen. A standard error is anytime you get an error message, that's standard error. So I'm going to go over redirecting output now. So if you wanted to redirect standard output, for example, that's pretty easy to do. Let's say you wanted to save the contents of a directory into a text file. So before you saw me do ls and then my home directory, which showed you all the files. Now say for example that I wanted to redirect the output to a file. Well, that's actually pretty easy to do. You just type a greater than symbol and then a text file. And notice that when I press enter, nothing displayed. That's because I redirected standard output to a text file. Now this text file will have the contents of the ls command. So if I do cat test file, enter, it shows the contents of that text file. It's showing it to standard output because it's showing it on my terminal. But basically, I redirected the standard output of the ls command, I redirected it to a text file that I named test file. And since I redirected standard output, it's putting the output into a file rather than printing it to the terminal. Now, one thing to understand is standard input is designated by a 0, standard output is designated by a 1, and standard error is designated by a 2. That's important for you to remember. Again, standard input is designated by a 0, Standard output is designated by a 1, and standard error is designated by a 2. Now notice, when I did the redirect here, I didn't actually put a number here. That's because standard output is assumed. Now as I mentioned, standard output is 1. So if I put a 1 here, which means I specifically want standard output to be redirected to this file. Press enter, the same thing will happen. Basically, that text file is going to include the contents of that home directory. And notice that if there was an error in here, it would not have redirected that. Standard error is 2. Now if I did this, I want to, since standard error is 2, I want to redirect any error messages into the text file and press enter. Basically, what's happening here is standard output was shown to the terminal because I didn't redirect the output, I only redirected the error. And there were no errors. So if I do cat test file again, you'll see that now the file is empty. And the reason why is because there were no errors. All the ls command does is it just displays the contents, the contents of a directory. It's really hard to get an error in that, unless of course you are trying to ls against a folder you don't have access to. ls/root, permission denied. Now check this out. If I do ls/root and then I redirect standard output to a text file, notice that it still printed the error to the screen. Well, I redirected standard output. I didn't redirect standard error. There is no standard output. And the reason for that is because all this command is going to do is just display an error message. And this error message is designated by a 2, and I only redirected standard output. So what I'll do now is I'll redirect standard error, which again is 2. Notice now that nothing displayed to the terminal. That's because, again, this command only generates an error because a normal user account does not have access for to view the contents. So now if I check the contents of that file, you'll see that it includes just the error message. So I redirected standard error to a file. And that's basically the difference between standard output and standard error and redirecting accordingly. Now, one other thing that I want to make sure you understand is you probably noticed that every time I redirected something, the test file here got replaced with that output. It didn't just add it to the end. Now I'm going to demonstrate how to append output rather than replace. Now an echo command is one command that's useful in demonstrating this. I don't know if I've ever shown you guys this before, but if you type echo space and then something in quotation marks, all it does is it just prints it to standard output, putting it, showing it on your terminal, because that's what standard output does. It'd be the same thing as if I redirected standard output to a file, and now the file is going to include the word hi. Now, what if I just want to add something to the end of that file, but I don't want to replace what's there currently? Well, to do that, you use 2 greater than symbols rather than 1. So I'm going to do hello, what's up? Or excuse me, I'm just going to type what's up. I'll press enter, and now what happens when I do a cat command against a text file? Notice that now, instead of replacing it with the new contents, the 2 greater than symbols basically means to redirect output to the end of the file. See, 1 greater than symbol means replace that entire text file, meaning delete it, and then replace it with the new output. But if you have 2 greater than symbols, what it's going to do is, instead of replacing it, it's just going to add the new contents to the end of it. So that has been your quick tutorial on standard input and standard output, and a quick mention of standard input, output, and error, and how to redirect standard output into a file and standard error into a file. But just to go over it one more time to make sure you understand it, standard input is designated by a 0. We didn't talk much about that because that is basically for bash scripting, and that's not what this series is for. But anyway, standard output is 1 and standard error is 2. And to go over a few of the examples here, ls/root is basically an error because we don't have access to see it, so we're going to redirect any errors into a text file. And you see here, I redirected standard output of this command to a text file. There was no standard output because it's only, only going to show you an error. And just doing, redirecting echo hi to a text file is only going to redirect standard output, because standard output is assumed. It's the same thing as if I pressed 1 here beforehand, and so on. And then I also taught you the difference between 1 greater than symbol and 2. 1 greater than symbol replaces the text file, and then another greater than symbol, having 2, appends it to the end. So I hope that makes sense. I understand that this can be a very confusing concept to learn, but it is one that I want to make sure that you understand, because now we're drawing near to a close on this series, and as you self-study and learn more about Linux and Linux commands, you are going to see standard input and output and error mentioned quite often. So just want to make sure you understand it. And again, if you want to understand more advanced concepts about this subject and several others, check out my batch scripting tutorial series, and you'll get some more information on that. But in the meantime, I'm going to make you a few more tutorials in this series until we call it done, because I think I have shown you the basics of running commands on the Linux shell, and I hope you've enjoyed it so far. So just a few more videos to go. But in the meantime, thank you for watching. I appreciate all of you, and please subscribe to my channel.